It's 1568 in the city of Toledo, Spain, and a scrivener's wife named Elvira del Campo is being walked down a stone staircase by two men who won't look at her. The room she's being led into has no spikes in the walls, no cages hanging from the ceiling, no giant bronze statue waiting to cook her alive. It has a table. It has a chair. It has a man with a quill whose entire job today is to write down everything that happens to her in perfectly neat handwriting. And unlike the sketch you're already thinking of, absolutely nobody in this room is surprised to see the Spanish Inquisition. Elvira's crime, as far as anyone can prove, is that she stopped eating pork. That's it. That's enough to get you here in 1568 Spain. Here's the promise of this video. We are going through every single torture device people associate with the Spanish Inquisition. The Iron Maiden, the pear-shaped skull crusher, the spiked chair, all of it. And by the end, you'll know exactly which ones are real, which ones are Victorian gift shop fiction, and why the real ones, the boring ones, the ones with rules and forms and a guy taking notes, are so much worse than anything a museum ever invented. But little did the Inquisition know that 4 centuries later, tourists would be paying €8 a ticket to look at torture devices it never actually owned. Let's start with what it actually did own. Rewind to 1478. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella have just finished unifying Spain through marriage and conquest. And like most rulers who've just finished unifying a country, they immediately go looking for someone to blame for the parts that still feel messy. That someone is the conversos, Jews who converted to Catholicism, some sincerely, some under serious pressure, who the crown now suspects of secretly practicing Judaism behind closed doors. So Ferdinand and Isabella get permission from the Pope to set up their own Inquisition, one that answers to the Spanish crown instead of Rome. Therefore, in November of 1478, the Spanish Inquisition is born, and unlike your average bloated government department, this one gets efficient fast. By 1481, 6 people are burned in Seville within months of the first tribunal opening its doors. By 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella expel every Jew in Spain who won't convert, somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people forced out with almost no notice. A guy named Tomás de Torquemada becomes Inquisitor General right around this time, and his name is going to become a byword for religious cruelty for the next 500 years, mostly because he was extremely good at his paperwork. Which brings us to the part nobody puts in the museum brochure. The paperwork is the whole story, because before we get to a single device, we have to talk about the rule book. Here's the thing that surprises almost everyone. The Spanish Inquisition did not want you to just get tortured on a whim. It wanted you tortured within the guidelines. Torquemada's own instructions, written in 1484, laid it out like a compliance manual. Torture could only be used if the tribunal already had what they called half-proof against you, meaning they were already pretty sure you were guilty and just wanted a confession to close the file. It was supposed to happen exactly once in a single session, and a physician was sometimes brought in beforehand to make sure you were healthy enough not to just die during questioning, because a dead suspect can't sign a confession. No permanent injury, no blood, on paper at least. And a notary had to sit in the room and transcribe the entire thing, word for word, including your screams, in the same flat legal tone he'd used to record a property dispute. Now, if you're already spotting the loophole, congratulations, so did the Inquisition. Torture couldn't be repeated, but it could be suspended and continued the next day, which is the kind of legal technicality that should get someone fired from HR and instead got someone promoted in 15th century Spain. Before any of it even started, there was one more step called the territio. They'd walk you into the torture chamber first, show you the devices, and just wait. A shocking number of people confessed to everything the second they saw the room. Honestly, respect the efficiency, but when a walkthrough and a stern look didn't work, the Inquisition had exactly 3 tools it actually reached for. But before we get to them, one more detail about the rulebook that explains a lot about how enthusiastically it got followed. Here's a detail that never makes the tourist museum plaque. The Spanish Inquisition had no state salary budget of its own. It paid its own bills by confiscating the property of the people it convicted: houses, farms, workshops, jewelry, all of it. So every guilty verdict wasn't just a spiritual win, it was also structurally a paycheck. Therefore, an institution built to investigate secret heresy had a direct financial incentive to keep finding some, which is the kind of conflict of interest that would get an entire department fired today and instead ran a country's court system for 3.5 centuries. Keep that in your back pocket because it's going to matter later. Now, the actual tools, device number one, the garrucha, which is Spanish for pulley, because the Inquisition was not in the business of giving its equipment scary names. Your wrists are tied behind your back. The rope runs up through a pulley bolted to the ceiling, and sometimes weights are tied to your ankles for good measure. Then you're hoisted straight up off the floor by your own arms, twisted behind you until your shoulders are doing a job shoulders were never designed to do. And then, and this is the part that made it a favorite, you're dropped, not all the way to the floor, just short of it. So the rope snaps taut and your entire body weight slams back onto joints that are already screaming. Shoulders dislocate. Sometimes they just pop straight out of the socket on the first drop. The interrogator asks his questions in between drops, like some horrific, torturous version of a game show buzzer round, except the prize for a wrong answer is another drop. It's simple. It's cheap. It requires basically no equipment beyond a rope and a hook. And therefore, it became the Inquisition's go-to opening move in torture chambers across Spain for 3.5 centuries. Device number two, the toca. And if this one sounds familiar, that's because it's waterboarding. 400 years before the term waterboarding existed, you're strapped down to a wooden frame, tilted back so your head is lower than your feet, and a strip of cloth, the toca, is forced into your mouth and down your throat. Then water gets poured slowly onto the cloth. Your body knows exactly what's happening. Even if your brain is trying to catch up, you are drowning in real time while lying perfectly dry on a table in a stone room. The severity was literally measured in units of water: 1 jar, 2 jars, sometimes as many as 6 or 8. Each one roughly a liter, like a horrifying wine tasting where every pour makes you more certain you're about to die. Between jars, they'd pull the cloth out just long enough for you to gasp actual air, ask their question again, and if they didn't like the answer, the next jar was already waiting. No blade, no fire, no blood on the record, just water, cloth, and time, which is somehow the setting where the Inquisition's own rulebook felt most comfortable because on paper, nobody got hurt. Which brings us back to Elvira del Campo, still lying on the third device, the potro. Picture a wooden frame shaped like a ladder, tilted so your head sits lower than your feet, with the rungs deliberately spaced to press into your spine. Cords are wound around your bare arms and legs, and the torturer works a wooden lever that tightens each cord, 1/2 turn at a time, a vuelta. 3 turns was considered routine. 5 was considered extreme, and by 5, the cords have usually cut clean through skin and into muscle. And this is where the Inquisition's paperwork habit becomes almost unbearable to read, because the transcript from Elvira's session survives, word for word, exactly as the notary wrote it down while it happened. Between turns of the cord, she says the same thing over and over in slightly different ways because she genuinely does not know what confession will make it stop. Tell me what you want, the record has her saying, for I don't know what to say. That line was written down by a man being paid to stay calm while he heard it. He kept writing. So no, there was no bronze bull here, no spiked pendulum swinging slowly toward anyone's chest. Just cord, a lever, and a bored professional taking dictation from someone's worst day, which somehow lands heavier than any prop a museum ever built. Take a breath, because we've earned one. It's time to talk about the gift shop. Quick reality check before we get to the fun part, because the actual numbers are almost more shocking than the myths. For a long time, the going estimate for Inquisition executions was north of 30,000 people, a figure popularized by a 19th century Spanish priest turned fierce critic of the institution named Juan Antonio Lorente. Modern historians, working from the actual surviving trial records, instead of Lorente's back of napkin math, put the real number at somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 executions across the entire 356-year run out of roughly 150,000 cases processed. Still horrific. Just not worst thing that ever happened in human history, horrific, which is what 4 centuries of propaganda turned it into. And remember that financial incentive from a few minutes ago? The single deadliest stretch of the entire Inquisition is 1480 to 1530, exactly the decades when wealthy conversos, the newest and richest converts in Spain, had the most property left to confiscate. Funny how that works out. And torture itself, historians who've actually counted the trial records put it at somewhere around 1% to 2% of cases during the Inquisition's harshest early decades, which means the horror show wasn't the torture chamber. It was the 1% to 2% chance you'd end up in one hanging over every single person who ever got a knock on the door. Now, about that gift shop, here's a fun experiment. Walk into any medieval torture museum in a European tourist town, and I promise you'll find an Iron Maiden, a spiked metal coffin shaped like a person that closes on the victim and impales them from every angle at once. Here's the twist. It never existed. Not in the Spanish Inquisition, not anywhere in medieval Europe. There is no documented reference to an Iron Maiden before the 19th century, and historians now believe it was assembled by Victorian museum owners out of older, unrelated objects because Victorian audiences loved nothing more than a good, terrifying prop. Basically, the Iron Maiden is medieval torture cosplay invented by guys with top hats who really understood ticket sales. Next up, the Pear of Anguish, a spiked bulb you insert and expand with a screw, also almost certainly never used for what the plaques claim. Surviving examples have springs consistent with early modern craftsmanship, and some historians think they were actually medical tools or boot stretchers that got a much scarier backstory once nobody living remembered what they were actually for. The Judas cradle, the spiked pyramid chair supposedly used to impale sitting victims, no mention in a single surviving Inquisition trial document anywhere, ever. The Spanish donkey, spiked thumbscrews, all the greatest hits of every dungeon gift shop from here to Transylvania, either invented wholesale, borrowed from a completely different country's court system, or Victorian showpieces built to look old. So how did all of this get attached specifically to Spain? Meet the Black Legend. Starting in the 1500s, Spain's political rivals, England, the Netherlands, France, all locked in wars and trade fights with the Spanish crown, ran a centuries-long propaganda campaign painting Spain as uniquely, cartoonishly cruel. An 18th century French engraver named Bernard Picart produced lurid illustrations of Inquisition torture chambers that scandalized all of Europe, and quite a few of the devices in those engravings simply do not appear in a single Spanish trial record. The propaganda worked so well that 200 years later, actual gift shops in actual Spanish tourist towns are still selling replicas of torture devices invented by the Spanish crown's political enemies to make Spain look bad. That is a genuinely impressive marketing afterlife. It's just also technically, historically fake. Real quick, because we can't talk about the Inquisition without the auto da fe, literally act of faith, the public ceremony where sentences actually got carried out. These were events, not quiet executions. Banners, processions, sermons, thousands of spectators. A single auto da fe in Madrid in 1680 drew a crowd of roughly 50,000 people to watch 118 sentences read out. Here's the detail that tends to surprise people. If you confessed and repented, even at the very last minute, you were garroted, strangled with an iron collar, before the fire ever touched you. Mercy, Inquisition style, was dying first and burning second. If you refused to repent, you burned alive, fully conscious, in front of the crowd because the whole point of the ceremony was making damnation visible. It is genuinely one of the bleakest sentences I've ever had to write for this channel. So let's pivot because there's a plot twist coming that I promise you did not see coming. In 1609, a massive witch panic breaks out in the Basque region of northern Spain in a village called Zugarramurdi. And by massive, I mean nearly 2,000 people, including children, get accused of witchcraft in a matter of months. This is exactly the kind of moment where across the rest of Europe, tens of thousands of people were about to be burned over the next century in witch panics in Germany, Scotland, and France. So the Inquisition sends 3 inquisitors to investigate. 2 of them are ready to start burning. But the third, a young inquisitor named Alonso de Salazar Frias, decides to actually do his job properly. He spends 18 months personally traveling from village to village, interviewing the accused one at a time, and comes back with an inconvenient conclusion. There is no witchcraft here. Just frightened people, bad dreams, and neighbors settling old scores through the fastest legal weapon available. Salazar writes it all up and convinces the Spanish Inquisition's Central Council to essentially shut the whole witch hunting machine down, and it works. Historians now credit Salazar with helping Spain avoid the worst of Europe's witch hunting craze roughly a century before the rest of the continent came to its senses. So somehow, buried inside one of history's most infamous instruments of religious cruelty is the guy who did more to stop a witch panic than most of Europe's actual witch trials ever managed to do for the people accused in them. History, everybody, never ever simple. So here's where we land. The Spanish Inquisition did not run a haunted house basement full of spiked coffins and skull-crushing pears. It ran, for 356 years, on exactly 3 simple tools: a rope, a jug of water, and a wooden ladder, backed by rules, forms, a notary, and a physician on call, wielded against maybe 1 or 2 people out of every 100 who came through the door. The devices in the tourist museum are more comfortable to look at, honestly, because they're obviously fictional. Nobody actually believes an iron-spiked coffin was ever practical. A cord, a lever, and a man calmly writing down the words, "Tell me what you want, for I don't know what to say," is a lot harder to look away from because every part of it is real. That's the actual lesson hiding under the myths. The boring, rule-bound, form and triplicate version of cruelty is the one history actually kept receipts for. So which was worse, the horror stories we made up or the paperwork we didn't have to? Let us know what you think in the comments and tell us which history myth you want debunked next.